The lecture hall looked like a quiet storm held in glass. Rows of tiered benches curved toward a central demonstration dais, and the ceiling arched high enough to cradle a small shuttle, ribbed with vents and fire suppression nozzles that waited like a white forest above polished metal. Conduits ran in clean lines along the walls to armored breaker boxes, each sealed with a transparent panel that showed nothing but dark switches. A cluster of emergency sand canisters sat beside a rack of dull ceramic pans. The Academy never trusted assignments with the word fire in them unless the room could swallow flame without flinching. Instructor Hark Avet stepped onto the dais with a slate in his left hand and a steel stylus in his right. He had the unhurried gait of a man who enjoyed the silence that came before comprehension. His voice carried easily, warm and steady, and the hall answered with a hush that ran outward in ripples as cadets folded wings, drew tails closer, or tucked hands beneath desks. "Combustion," he said, letting the word hang like a match head above rough stone. Not plasma discharge, not weapon ignition, not reactor bleed. Combustion that uses ambient atmosphere. Each of you will demonstrate how your species discovered or maintains it. No external power sources. No illegal accelerants. The room has air, mineral stock, fiber stock, and water. The room will remain at standard humidity. Your display must be controlled, and your explanation must include the underlying mechanism. Begin. He tapped the slate. Panels under the benches unlocked with soft clicks, revealing bins of permitted materials. Mineral chips in cloth pouches, fiber mats, dried bark, cords, friction blocks of engineered ceramic. The graduating class breathed out as one, and the hall shifted from stillness to that particular busy quiet that lives between curiosity and performance. An Altarian girl, 2 rows above Mara Vale, opened her bin with a crystalline chime, lifted a pair of hexagonal crystals, and cradled them in her palms like small, sleeping skylarks. A Vosser male in the left bank rolled his shoulders, the armor sheath over each claw rasping as it retracted. A Remnari boy with translucent skin traced a circle over a packet of mineral powder and smiled with nervous pride. Mara kept her hands at her sides for a full breath and looked at the room the way a sailor reads a harbor in late light. She watched the vents breathe. She watched the shimmer of air above the dais where heat would pool if someone forgot the simplest rule of flame. It climbs. She watched Hark Avet set the stylus on the slate and fold his arms. The tell of a man who would not rescue a cadet from the wrong lesson until the wrong lesson had burned once. Her own bin waited under the bench, and she slid it open with her knee. Coarse fiber lay in a coil, clean and dry. A small friction block, scored in long grooves, rested beside a short spindle that would bite into it without much ceremony. The packet of mineral chips clinked like dull coins. She touched none of it. Her eyes went instead to the far wall where a maintenance slot had been left ajar, no more than a finger's width, after a morning service call. A loop of copper peeked out like a punctuation mark. A few benches down, an insectoid cadet clicked mandibles in quick rhythm as she counted the grooves on her block, the sound bright and impatient. 2 crystalline boys in the back whispered about angle of attack and resonance, certain that the right pitch could call flame out of air. The room was full of birthrights tuned to heat. The humans had never owned one. The Altarian girl stepped first to the aisle, and the class leaned toward her as if hunger rode the air. She walked down to the dais, set her crystals on the ceramic tray, and rotated them until a seam met a seam. Light scattered from her forearms, refracted inside the facets, and gathered to a needle in the seam's gap. A thin thread of energy arced, kissed a tuft of fiber, and the tuft lifted into orange with a neat little hiss. The hall murmured approval. She explained lattice resonance and trace gas ionization, her voice calm despite the fragile glitter of her fractured arm. Hark Avet nodded once and made a note. On the left, the Vosir male sliced a length of bark into curls with a claw that looked like polished basalt. He arranged the curls, cupped his hand, and exhaled a dense, sweet-smelling vapor into the nest. He snapped the sheath along his thumb and dragged the hard inner ridge across the point of his index claw. The strike threw a pale, cold spark no larger than a gnat. It fell into the vapor and bloomed into a low blue flame that hugged the bark like water. He spoke about oils and surface area, about risks and self-control, and ended with a chest-deep breath that made the flame wilt and then die. More murmurs. A Remnari boy mixed powdered mineral with a drop of water until it turned into a paste that shimmered like melted moonlight. He rolled it thin, laid it on a rock, and pressed a second rock over it with a slow grind. The friction liberated heat from the lattice with a tiny cry that sounded almost sorry for itself. The paste crust cracked, flashed, and a spark crawled into a waiting bed of shaved cord. Another demonstration, another competent explanation. Hark Avet marked his slate. The room had enjoyed itself by the time the 4th and 5th cadets were done. Each performance echoed a memory sung on home soil. Each display felt like a ritual honed by ancestors, repackaged for a classroom that could erase scorch marks at the touch of a panel. Mara waited without fidgeting. The copper loop in the maintenance slot had not moved. The vents still breathed. The bins still offered the same standard stock for anyone who wanted the same standard solution. She knew the old tricks and respected them. She could spin the spindle. She could grind stone on stone until a spark fell like a tired moth. The class would nod and mark the human as adequate, perhaps even diligent. Adequate did not interest her. She did not crave drama. She craved the lesson that would stick in a mind that preferred to forget what it could not categorize. Fire, for her ancestors, had been a theft first and a craft second. She stood and felt 20 heads turn in a small, involuntary wave that moved down toward the dais. The sensation slid over her skin like light rain. She carried her bin because the rules asked for it, and she crossed the aisle because the room had been built to expect that choreography. When she reached the edge of the dais, she set the bin on the floor and did not open it. Hark Avet watched her with the same patient blankness he gave every cadet. His eyebrows lifted a millimeter when she stepped away from the tray and walked to the maintenance slot. He did not speak. He did not need to. The rules had been clear. No external power, no illegal accelerants, ambient air only. She touched the edge of the slot with 2 fingers and felt the small heat of conduits living behind the wall. The loop of copper was not live. It could not be. The breaker above it showed dead dark. The wire smelled like dust and a little machine oil, the kind maintenance techs used when a grommet refused to seat. She eased the loop out, coaxing a longer length into her palm, and found its mate tucked just behind it, a twin turned back on itself by an absent-minded hand. 2 simple leads, cut and curled, forgotten because no one thought anything valuable still lived in dead metal. She held both and walked back to the dais. The class made a new sound, a cross between laughter and curiosity, the sound a room makes when certainty flexes and finds a seam. A crystalline boy leaned forward until his forehead plate almost touched the bench. The Vossir male rolled one shoulder and narrowed his eyes. The insectoid girl tilted her head and clicked twice in disbelief. Mara did not watch them. She looked at the fiber coil in her bin and the dust at the bottom of the packet. She pinched a pinch between finger and thumb and felt the grit of mineral mixed with whatever the bin maker had used as anti-caking agent. She set the pinch aside and took a square of fiber, teasing it into a loose nest, feathering the edges until air could slide through and sit there like a promise. She placed a thin strip of dried bark beneath the nest to lift it away from the heat sink of the ceramic pan. She glanced at the vents. They breathed on, indifferent and steady. Hark Avet did not move. "Explain your intention before you begin," he said, tone unchanged. "I will use friction and pressure to create heat at the point of contact," she said. "I will not rely on plasma, batteries, or chemical bonds that release heat on contact. I will use metal's willingness to trade surface for temperature when it is forced to slip. I will prepare tinder that accepts a small ember without smothering it. And your variables? Contact area, speed, pressure, and time," she said, "plus patience." He nodded once, the same nod he gave the others. The room gathered itself closer. She looped the first wire around her left hand and the second around her right, leaving short free ends that crossed at the center of the pan above the feathered nest. She pressed the free ends together at a shallow angle so the contact patch stayed small. She began to move her hands in opposite arcs, rubbing the wires not in wild scrapes that would only polish them, but in tight, rhythmic strokes that forced the oxides at the surface to break and reform in pulses. Metal whispered to metal with a sound like a match trying to remember itself. She kept the pressure steady, resisting the urge to chase speed before the heat had a place to live. The copper warmed against her fingertips. The first impulse to glance up rose and died. She let the room vanish until her world contracted to the strip of contact, the sweet faint smell of warmed insulation somewhere along one lead, the way the nest breathed under the small currents she disturbed. Heat came in slow, the way dawn edges through blinds before it floods a room. She adjusted angle, shaved the contact patch thinner, increased pressure by a hair, and kept the rhythm. The wires began to drag, the microscopic bite rising and falling with each pass. She fed that drag with patience instead of force. She was not striking a spark from stone. She was grinding heat into a point that would give before it fled. The nest waited, feather-light and loyal to breath. The room, which had tolerated noise for earlier displays, climbed into silence as if a sudden wind had pressed it down. Harkavet's stylus hovered a centimeter above the slate and stayed there. The vents kept breathing. A small curl of smoke lifted from the point where metal kissed metal and swayed, indecisive, before it thinned into the air. The class exhaled as one organism. Mara did not stop. She did not chase the smoke. She made the heat and let the smoke decide. The copper brightened at the edge of her vision, not with light, but with a faint color that only hands understand. She released the pressure by a whisper, moved the contact point half a grain down, and saw the tiniest ash dust settle on the fiber. It was not flame. It was a seed that wanted careful ground. She kept the motion steady, fed the seed, and waited for the moment when everything would need to change at once. The assignment had not required surprise. It had required demonstration and explanation. She intended to give both, and she intended to teach something that would sting a little and then stay. The room brought its face close to the pan. The wire ends sang on, and the ember at last showed a small, sullen orange at the border of the feathered nest. She stopped. She lifted the wires and set them aside without hurry. She cupped her hands and bent, not to blow, but to breathe the way a mother hums a child to warmth, a slow, even exhale that carried heat without violence. The ember deepened. The nest accepted. The orange widened in a ring that licked at air and found that air sweet. A tiny tongue of flame lifted, tasted bark, and stayed. Harkavet had told the class to begin. She had begun. The hall was full of reflected light on crystal and scale, a low gold that turned the steel rails along the aisles into warm bone. The demonstration had not finished. It had only found its first word. The small flame still danced on the fiber nest, its orange glow trembling with each breath of air in the hall, when Instructor Harkavet raised his hand to steady the room. He did not extinguish the silence. He sharpened it. "You have witnessed one method," he said, his voice calm. "Now you will see others. Observe closely. Every demonstration reveals not only technique, but history. Fire tells you what a species remembers about itself." His words hung in the air, and the class shifted restlessly on the benches. The crystalline Altarian girl rose again, her fractured arm now casting prisms of light as she carried her crystals back to her seat. She looked both proud and faintly wounded, as if the human's display had unsettled something deeper than competition. Harkavet's eyes moved deliberately along the rows, and then he lifted his stylus to the next name. "Corvin Triss," he called, and an insectoid cadet with a hard, shining carapace clicked upright. His legs moved with precise angular rhythm as he descended to the dais. His eyes, Black, glossy domes reflected the still glowing ember in the pan, but his mandibles showed no expression. He set down a pair of stones, each veined with silvery streaks, and without hesitation began to grind them together. Sparks leapt instantly, a bright spray like shattered stars. He caught them on a mat of resin-soaked fibers, which flared into greenish fire. He raised it high in his claws, letting the light paint his faceplates. "We harvest pyrite veins from cliffs," he said in clipped tones. "Generations of Corvin learned by watching lightning strike stone and flame follow. The method is efficient, repeatable, and requires no accident of birth. It honors discipline." He stamped the burning mat into ash with one sharp strike and returned to his seat, the smell of resin heavy in his wake. The crystalline cadets nodded with approval. The Vossier male smirked faintly, unimpressed. Hark Avet made his mark on the slate, then called another. This time it was a tall amphibian girl with mottled blue skin, her body marked by small sacs along her neck that pulsed faintly with each breath. She stepped forward shyly, carrying nothing. She cupped her hands to her mouth and inhaled. Her throat sacs swelled, and when she exhaled, a fine spray filled the air. It smelled acrid, sharp. A moment later, she pressed her palms together, and the fluid ignited in a startling flash, a plume of orange fire that licked the ceiling before she quickly clapped her hands shut to smother it. The class hissed in collective awe, and her cheeks flushed dark with pride. "The secretion is volatile," she explained softly. "On my world, we used it to burn marsh reeds for clearing. It is a gift from the body, but also a danger. My people learn control before words." She bowed slightly, placed her hands in a basin of sand to cool them, and stepped back. Hark Avet inclined his head. "Inherent advantage," he said quietly. "Yet advantage often costs discipline if not tempered. Remember that." The words made the amphibian girl lower her gaze. The next cadet, a stocky reptilian male with emerald scales, thudded forward with visible confidence. He carried a small satchel filled with powdery minerals, scooped a mound onto the ceramic tray, and struck his claws together with a ringing crack. The sparks landed in the powder, which exploded into a flare of yellow flame so intense that the front row of cadets leaned back instinctively. He grinned, baring teeth that glowed faintly in the light. "My ancestors burned caves open to make shelter," he declared proudly. "This fire is not just warmth, it is conquest. Stone yields when it meets flame." The statement carried weight, but the arrogance in his voice earned him little warmth from the instructor. Hark Avet simply noted the result, then gestured to the next name. One by one, the demonstrations continued. A slim girl from a crystalline race fractured a shard of her own forearm plate and used it to focus light into a tinder nest, producing a sharp white flame that sputtered like a blade striking steel. A Remnari boy crushed a pouch of chemicals and set it alight with a single drop of water, creating a soft violet flame that pulsed gently. Each cadet stepped forward with confidence born of tradition, each showing a method tied to heritage, body, or inherited mineral knowledge. Yet as the line dwindled, more and more eyes turned toward Mara Vale. She sat still, her hands folded loosely on her knees, her gaze calm as if she had already finished her part. The flame she had coaxed with wires had not burned long, but the image of it remained in the minds of her peers. Unlike the others, her fire had not come from a gift of physiology or a geological ritual polished by centuries. It had come from the decision to see discarded copper not as trash, but as possibility. When the final cadet, a heavy-set avian boy with downy feathers, demonstrated a weak spark by rubbing friction blocks together, the class gave polite acknowledgement and then turned almost in unison to Mara once again. Her ember had become the quiet anchor of the day. Hark Avet let the silence grow. He wanted the comparison to be their own, not his. He closed the slate with a soft snap and rested the stylus across it. "You have all given flame to this room," he said. "Some with body, some with stone, some with inherited gifts. and one among you with what the others ignored. I do not judge which is brighter. I judge only what the flame reveals. A gift may be powerful. A tool may be efficient. But invention is what endures when the gift fails and the tool is gone. His eyes passed across the rows, but for an instant his gaze lingered on Mara, not in approval, not in favoritism, but in acknowledgement. She met it without flinching, her expression unreadable, her posture steady. The lesson had not concluded, but its weight had shifted. For the first time in the class, the cadets whispered not about themselves but about her, and in the whispers lived both unease and a new, reluctant respect. The room still smelled of burned resin, acid spray, mineral smoke, and copper heat. But beneath it all hung something sharper, the realization that what the human had lit was more than fire. It was the idea that survival might favor the mind that sees possibility where others see only scraps. That idea would not extinguish easily. The ember that Mara Vale had coaxed with the copper wires still lingered in the thoughts of the class when the instructor dismissed the formal demonstrations. Yet the lesson was not over. Hark Avett believed in repetition through challenge, and he rarely let the cadets rest when their minds were stirred. He clapped his hands once, the sound sharp against the fireproof walls, and ordered the class to pair up and replicate another species' method of making fire. He did this not for entertainment, but to measure adaptability. It was one thing to create flame using a gift of one's own body. It was another to understand how another mind approached the same element. The hall shifted into movement again. The crystalline girl with fractured arm traded places with the insectoid cadet, exchanging crystals for stones. The reptilian male barked in irritation as he fumbled with chemical powders, while the amphibian girl struggled to control the pyrite sparks that scorched her palms. Some succeeded clumsily, others failed outright, but all were forced to confront the gap between instinct and ingenuity. Mara watched without moving at first, her expression calm, though her eyes missed nothing. She saw how the crystalline shards lost their precision in the hands of claws built for tearing, not refracting. She noticed how the amphibian girl grimaced at the acrid mineral smoke that burned her delicate throat. She studied the patterns of error, the way each cadet leaned back into habits when pressed. Her turn came when the Vossir male, frustrated after his attempt with crystals, shoved the stones toward her and muttered that she would have better luck. She accepted them quietly, the weight of pyrite firm in her palms. She held them with the lightness of one who understood tools were not meant to be wrestled, but guided. She brought them together with measured rhythm, grinding not violently, but with steady patience. The sparks came after only a few passes, small and bright, scattering across the fiber mat she had prepared in advance. A single ember took hold, glowing as though it recognized her breath. She bent low, exhaled carefully, and the flame rose again. The reptilian male frowned, his pride pierced by how easily she had achieved what others had bungled. The crystalline girl watched with narrowed eyes, the refracted light of her fractured arm casting faint rainbows over Mara's calm face. Even the insectoid cadet paused in her attempts to grind crystals, her mandibles clicking faintly in thought. Instructor Hark Avett allowed the scene to unfold without interruption. He knew lessons embedded deeper when silence stretched longer. Only when the flame stabilized did he speak. Observation and patience, he said evenly. Those who failed pressed too hard, struck too wildly, assumed fire is a gift that leaps to the impatient. Fire is no gift. Fire is persuasion. His eyes swept across the cadets before resting briefly on Mara again. The pairing exercise ended in scattered successes. Many cadets returned to their seats smelling of scorched fiber or with faint burns etched into their skin. The amphibian girl dabbed her palms in a basin of sand to cool them, while the crystalline cadets picked flakes of ash from their shards. Mara remained quiet, but the faint soot streaking her fingers told a story that the others could not ignore. She had not only managed her own demonstration, She had replicated another's with more grace than those who had inherited it. The murmurs began after the instructor left them to record observations. Some cadets spoke in sharp whispers, irritation lacing their tones. The reptilian male muttered that the human had cheated, though no one had seen a rule broken. The insectoid cadet argued that simplicity did not diminish effectiveness. The crystalline girl remained silent, though her eyes tracked Mara with a scrutiny that was sharper than her crystals. Mara sat with her notebook open, her words written in a neat, steady hand. She did not write about triumph or failure. She recorded patterns, how the amphibian's volatile secretion reacted differently in dry air, how the insectoid's resin smoke choked certain throats faster than others, how mineral sparks required patience more than strength. She was not writing to prove herself. She was writing to remember what others had not seen. As the day stretched, the cadets grew restless. The smell of burned fibers and scorched resin clung to their clothes, their pride bruised from the forced imitation. Yet Mara remained steady, her focus never slipping. The others had shown their heritage, their gifts. She had shown choice, and choice unsettled them more than any flame. When the final bell rang, dismissing the session, the cadets filed out of the hall with uneven steps. Some walked quickly, eager to leave behind the smoke and the embarrassment. Others lingered, glancing toward Mara as though searching for cracks in her composure. She did not rise until the last of them had gone. She closed her notebook, gathered the copper wires, and tucked them into her pocket as if they were no more than scraps. Instructor Hark Avet remained on the dais, his arms folded, watching her with the calm scrutiny of a man who had seen generations of cadets break or sharpen under pressure. He did not speak as she passed him. He only gave the smallest nod, the kind that acknowledged not just competence, but understanding. Outside the hall, the corridors of the academy buzzed with chatter, yet Mara moved through it as though she walked in still water. She carried the faint smell of smoke with her, but not as a mark of accident. It was a mark of control. For her, fire was not a spectacle. It was proof that resourcefulness could ignite respect where none had been offered. And for the first time, some of her classmates began to understand that the human in their midst carried more than fragile skin and soft hands. She carried a way of thinking that lit rooms as surely as flame. The following morning began with a tension that was heavier than the usual hum of routine. Word of Mara Vale's strange method with the copper wires had spread beyond her class overnight. By the time she entered the academy's central hall for the next session, curious faces from other cohorts were scattered along the back benches, waiting to see if the human girl would stumble after her unexpected triumph. She felt the eyes on her as she moved to her seat, but her step did not falter. She carried her notes under one arm, her hands smudged faintly with soot that no amount of scrubbing could fully erase. To her, the stain was neither shame nor trophy. It was simply part of the work. Instructor Hark Avet wasted no time with formalities. He stood at the center of the hall with his slate in hand, the stylus tapping once against the surface as he announced the next challenge. You have shown fire in its beginnings. Today you will show control. A flame that escapes its purpose is destruction. A flame that obeys is civilization. Each cadet will sustain a flame long enough to boil a measure of water and then extinguish it without leaving damage to the hall. His words silenced even the restless whispers from the observers. Assistants carried in small ceramic basins filled with water, setting one before each cadet. Fiber, resin, and mineral stock were once again made available, but the test now was no longer about ignition. It was about management. Several cadets immediately set to work, their movements brisk and confident. The reptilian male arranged bark curls with practiced speed, his claws sparking bright flares that leapt into flame almost instantly. He placed his basin above the heat and smirked as steam began to rise. The crystalline girl refracted light through her shards until a white flame licked at her fibers, her face stern with concentration. The insectoid cadet dripped resin carefully onto her tinder, clicking her mandibles as she kept the fire small but steady. Mara moved slowly, unhurried. She studied the materials in her bin and then glanced toward the copper wires still in her pocket. She did not need them for this task, but she kept them close, a reminder of how invention had served her before. She chose a handful of fiber and teased it into a loose nest, then placed thin splinters of bark around it in a careful lattice. She struck the pyrite stones with measured patience, coaxing sparks until one caught. The flame rose, small and tentative, and she bent to breathe it steady. Soon it climbed into the bark, crackling softly, its heat warming her hands. She balanced the ceramic basin above the flame, adjusting the sticks to keep the fire strong but not wild. Around her, cadets struggled with restraint. The reptilian male's fire flared too hot, and though his water boiled quickly, the basin blackened with soot, earning him a frown from the instructor. The amphibian girl winced as her volatile secretion produced a flame that sputtered dangerously close to the basin's edge, forcing her to smother it hastily with sand before it consumed the tinder. The crystalline girl's white flame burned bright but unstable, fracturing into sparks that skittered across the tray. She hissed in frustration and shifted her shards until the flame steadied, but by then her water had barely begun to steam. Mara's flame remained quiet and obedient, its rhythm even, its light golden. She fed it splinters one at a time, her eyes steady, her breath controlled. Steam rose from her basin, first in thin wisps, then in a steady plume. When bubbles broke the surface, she removed the sticks carefully, letting the fire shrink. She placed a broad leaf over the basin, capturing the heat and extinguishing the last tongue of flame with a sigh of smoke. The basin was warm, the water boiled, and the tray beneath remained unscarred. Hark Avett circled the room, inspecting each cadet's work. His gaze lingered on scorched trays, cracked fibers, and blackened basins. When he reached Mara, he paused. The tray was clean, the basin intact. The air above her station scented only with faint wood smoke. She met his eyes calmly, and he gave a single nod before moving on. His silence was more eloquent than praise. The murmurs began again, sharper this time. Some cadets whispered that the human was favored, that her tasks had been simpler. Others muttered that she had no real flame of her own, only borrowed tricks. Yet even as they spoke, they could not deny what they had seen. Her flame had not been the brightest, but it had been the most disciplined. She had shown mastery where others had shown only force. When the session ended, Hark Avett addressed the class from the dais. You have now seen the difference between possession and control. Many of you are gifted with flame by birth or by heritage, but gifts are brittle without patience. Civilization was not built on sparks. It was built on the ability to sustain fire, to keep it from consuming the one who calls it. His eyes swept the hall, pausing only briefly on Mara before moving on. The cadets filed out in uneasy silence, their pride cracked further. Some avoided her entirely. Others glared openly, their eyes sharp with resentment. Yet a few looked at her differently, quietly, thoughtfully, as if wondering what it meant that the soft-skinned human had mastered what their bodies had long claimed as strength. Mara walked from the hall with steady steps, the copper wires still resting in her pocket. She did not feel triumph or fear. What she carried was something quieter and heavier, the knowledge that she had shifted the ground beneath her classmates, and that nothing in the academy would look quite the same again. The final lesson in the fire module began on a day when the sky above the academy hung low and gray, as though the clouds themselves anticipated what the instructor would demand. The cadets gathered in the great hall once more, their movements slower than before, pride worn down by trial after trial. Some bore the faint marks of burns on their skin or fractures in their crystalline plates. Others carried only silence, the kind that grows heavier when envy festers, but words cannot find release. Mara Vale entered last, her steps even, her face composed, carrying nothing more than her notes and the memory of soot still lingering faintly on her hands. Instructor Hark Avett stood at the dais with no slate this time, his arms folded behind his back. The air seemed to draw taut as soon as he began to speak. You have shown how fire is born. You have shown how fire is sustained. Today you will show what fire means. The flame has never been only light or heat. It is symbol. It is weapon. It is hearth. It is signal. Each of you will choose how to show fire as more than a tool. This is not a contest of brightness. This is a measure of meaning. The words unsettled the cadets more than any previous assignment. It was easier to strike sparks than to interpret them, easier to boil water than to embody a concept. Yet the challenge hung in the hall like a gauntlet no one dared to leave lying. One by one, the cadets rose. The reptilian male went first, proud as ever. He carved bark into curls, stacked them high, and sparked them with his claws until the blaze roared. He declared that fire was conquest, the force that split stone and bent caves into homes. His flame burned hot, but it scorched the tray black, smoke clawing at the ceiling vents. Hark Avett's expression did not change. The crystalline girl followed. She used her fractured shard to refract light until it blossomed into a spear of white flame. She spoke of fire as purity, the essence of clarity and focus. Her voice rang sharp, but her flame sputtered and hissed, unstable despite her concentration. The light dazzled but did not warm, leaving the observers unsettled. The amphibian girl chose a gentler path. She sprayed a thin mist across fiber and coaxed a small flame that flickered low and blue. She whispered that fire was warning, a signal across the marshes of her world to call kin to safety. Her voice was fragile, her hands trembling as she held the flame close, but her sincerity gave the moment weight. Others followed with varying pride and hesitation. The insectoid cadet dripped resin onto stones and lit a green flame that she said was tradition, a fire kept by queens through seasons of hunger. The avian boy ignited sparks above his feathers and said fire was ceremony, a dance of light for ancestors. Each voice carried heritage, each flame spoke of something inherited. When it was Mara's turn, the hall grew hushed. She rose without hurry, carrying only the copper wires in her hand. She walked to the dais and placed a fiber nest in the pan. She rubbed the wires together with the same patient rhythm she had shown before until smoke rose, then coaxed the ember into flame. It glowed steady, modest, golden. She did not rush to make it large. Instead, she set her basin of water above it. The steam rose slowly, curling like a ghost into the air. She lifted a broad leaf, caught the vapor, and pressed it into her hand until droplets formed, dripping back into the basin. Her voice carried clearly, though she did not raise it. Fire is survival. Fire is choice. My people did not breathe sparks or inherit flame from our blood. We stole it first from the sky, then from stone, then from wire. We learned to feed it, to guard it, to hide it when it threatened to betray us. For us, fire is not conquest, not ceremony, not purity. It is the difference between night and morning. It is life when the world would take it away. The class listened in silence as the steam continued to rise. She let the flame shrink until it was nothing more than a soft glow. Then she pinched it out between her fingers and left the pan clean. She turned without bowing and returned to her seat. Hark Avett allowed the silence to deepen until it became almost unbearable. Then he spoke, his tone stripped of ornament. You have all spoken with fire. You have shown me what your people carry. You have seen what the human carries. Do not forget this day. Flame can be inherited. Flame can be crafted. Flame can be stolen. But in every case, it is meaning that keeps it alive. Without meaning, fire is ash. He dismissed the class with a wave of his hand, but no one moved quickly. The cadets filed out with glances that betrayed something shifting behind their eyes. Pride cracked further, envy sharpened, respect reluctant, but undeniable. The reptilian male looked away, his jaw clenched. The crystalline girl lowered her gaze, her shard dim in the cold light. The amphibian girl lingered at the door, her expression uncertain, torn between resentment and admiration. Mara left the hall last, as she often did. The copper wires rested in her pocket once more, no brighter than when she had first found them. Yet now they carried a weight that could not be measured in sparks. She walked into the gray daylight with steady steps, the air still carrying the faint smell of smoke and resin. The fire had been extinguished in the hall, but something remained alight in the minds of those who had witnessed it. It was not flame in the ordinary sense. It was the quiet recognition that ingenuity had stood beside heritage and not been found wanting. That recognition would not fade quickly. It would linger, carried forward in whispers, in grudges, and in the grudging respect of rivals who had learned that the human girl's strength was not in her hands, but in her choices. The lesson had ended, but the conclusion was clear. Fire was no gift. Fire was will, and will was what endured.